He came to the hospital at midnight and found her in the hallway outside his mother's room. Not crying, not packing, working. Her laptop balanced on her knees, phone pressed to her ear, voice low and steady as she negotiated with someone on the other end. A buyer, he realized. Someone buying something of hers. The overhead light carved shadows beneath her eyes that hadn't been there 3 weeks ago. On the plastic chair beside her sat a thermos of soup she hadn't touched, still wearing her coat because she hadn't had time to take it off. She didn't see him. He stood at the end of the corridor for a long time and didn't make a sound. Inside that room, his mother, the only person in the world whose opinion of him he had never been able to purchase, was sleeping peacefully. Alive, cared for, because of this woman. He turned around, walked back to the car, sat in the dark. Secretary Kim, in the driver's seat, did not ask. He had learned in 12 years of service that there were moments the boss needed silence the way other men needed air. This was one of those moments. Because Kang-Dae had spent 6 months building a lie to find the truth. And the truth, it turned out, was far more devastating than any answer he had been prepared to receive. There is a particular kind of stillness that belongs only to men who have never needed to raise their voice. Not the stillness of a man at rest, not the stillness of a man who has nothing to say, but the stillness of a man who has calculated, in a fraction of a second, exactly what each word would cost, and decided the price is too high. Kang-Dae had that stillness. He was 36 years old, and in the rooms that mattered, the ones without windows, the ones where agreements were made that never appeared in any contract, his name landed differently than other names. Not with fear exactly, with weight, the kind of weight that precedes an earthquake, the kind you feel in your chest before you understand what you're feeling. He had built his empire the way architects build foundations, invisibly, permanently, without sentiment. He had outlasted rivals who were hungrier. He had outmaneuvered partners who were smarter. He had walked away from negotiations that would have broken other men and driven home in silence while those men sat in the wreckage, wondering what had just happened. This was Kang-Dae. This was simply what he was. He had 43 missed calls on a phone he never answered in public. This was not unusual. What was unusual was that he was sitting in a laundromat at 9 in the evening, watching a single dress shirt rotate behind a fogged glass door, pretending it belonged to him. Secretary Kim was outside in the car, fielding the calls, running the empire by proxy. Somewhere across the city, 3 separate negotiations were either succeeding or collapsing without him, and Kang-Dae was here, beneath fluorescent lights that buzzed like a dying thing, drinking vending machine coffee that tasted like regret, because Hana lived 2 blocks away and sometimes walked past this place on her way home from the studio. He wasn't following her. He was simply present in her orbit, anonymously. This had become, he recognized with some private discomfort, a habit. The empire had not been built on sentiment. It had been built on precision, on the understanding that every person in every room wanted something, and that the man who identified that want before anyone else named it was the man who controlled the room. Kang-Dae had been identifying wants since he was 19 years old and had nothing in his pockets but nerve and a clarity of vision that unnerved men twice his age. Now he had everything. Holdings across 4 countries, loyalty that had been tested and proven in ways he preferred not to revisit, a name that functioned less like an identity and more like a weather system, something that arrived before he did and lingered after he left. And a fiancée who looked at him, sometimes, across a dinner table, with an expression so unguarded and so genuine that it made him want to stand up and walk out of the room. Not because he didn't want it, because he wanted it too much to trust it. This was the crack in the foundation, the one thing he had never been able to build around. He had watched, over years, what wealth did to people's feelings, had watched warmth become transaction, devotion become strategy, love become leverage. He had seen it in business partners who became leeches, in relatives who materialized during prosperity and evaporated during hardship. He had learned, slowly and without bitterness, that most people did not love you. They loved the version of you that was useful to them. He needed to know which kind Hana was. Not because he doubted her character, but because he doubted his own ability to see clearly through the distortion field that his money created around every relationship he had ever tried to have. The laundromat door opened. Cold air came in. A woman walked past the window outside, head down, bag heavy on her shoulder. Not Hana. He looked back at the shirt, rotating in the drum. 44 missed calls now. He finished the coffee, let it be. It took 11 minutes. That was how long it took, from the moment the first news alert pushed to phones across the financial district, for Kang-Dae's name to become a different kind of weather entirely. Not the steady, inevitable pressure of his usual presence. Something faster. Something that moved the way fire moves, finding every available opening, consuming everything it touched. Breaking, Kang Industries under federal investigation. Assets frozen. Chairman whereabouts unknown. Secretary Kim had choreographed it with the precision of a man who had spent 12 years learning that the boss's worst ideas were usually his most important ones. The leaked documents were real enough to survive scrutiny. The frozen accounts were real. The federal vehicles parked outside the Kang Industries tower at 7:45 in the morning. Those were real too, arranged through a chain of favors so long and so carefully constructed that no single link could ever see the whole. By 9 o'clock, the lobby had been cleared. By 10, 3 board members had already retained lawyers. By 11, the calls to Secretary Kim's secondary phone had stopped entirely, because the people who called that number were exactly the kind of people who disappeared when the sky changed. Kang-Dae watched it from a rooftop 2 blocks away, hands in the pockets of a jacket worth less than the coffee he'd thrown away that morning. It was working. That should have felt like something. It felt like nothing. Hana was in a client meeting when her assistant knocked and entered without waiting, which had never happened before in 4 years of working together. She knew before the phone was placed in front of her, something in the quality of the interruption, the particular texture of bad news arriving. She read the headline once, set the phone down, apologized to the clients with a composure that would later strike her assistant as almost frightening, walked them to the elevator, came back inside, stood at the window for a moment that stretched longer than it should have. Then she called him. The number rang out, an automated voice, impersonal and final. She called again, same result. On the 3rd attempt, Secretary Kim answered not Kang-Dae's phone, his own, and told her, in the careful, measured tone of a man delivering a script he found personally distasteful, that Kang-Dae could not be reached, that the situation was fluid, that she should not come to the building. "Where is he?" she asked. A pause. "Safe," Kim said, which was true, and which told her absolutely nothing. She stood in her studio for a long time after the call ended. Around her, the fabric samples and mood boards and half-finished sketches of other people's futures hung on the walls like a different life entirely. Then she picked up her keys. Not to leave. To go find him. The apartment was on the 4th floor of a building that smelled like damp concrete and other people's cooking. It had one window that faced a brick wall, a radiator that clicked through the night like a metronome counting down to nothing, a mattress that had belonged to someone else, and a single overhead bulb that swung slightly whenever the family upstairs moved around, which they did, constantly, at all hours, with a cheerful indifference to the concept of quiet. Kang-Dae had slept in worse places. Once, a very long time ago, before the empire, before the name, before the weather. He told himself this was simply returning to something he already knew. He told himself this on the first night, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, listening to the city exist without him, and almost believed it. She found him on the 3rd day. He didn't know how. He hadn't told her the address. Kim swore, with the particular brand of offended loyalty that meant he was telling the truth, that he hadn't given it to her either. But Hana had always had an instinct for finding things that were trying not to be found. It was why her design work was good. She noticed what was absent. She understood negative space. He heard her footsteps on the stairs before she knocked. a specific rhythm he recognized without meaning to. The way you recognize something that has become part of your internal weather without your permission. She knocked twice, waited, knocked once more. He opened the door. She looked at him the way she always looked at him, directly, without performance, and then she looked past him at the apartment, taking in the bare walls and the swinging bulb and the mattress on the floor. Her expression didn't change. That was the thing about Hana. Her face didn't negotiate. In her hands was a covered pot that was still warm. He could smell it from the doorway. Doenjang jjiggy, the way his mother made it, which meant she had called his mother for the recipe, which meant his mother, who was supposed to be maintaining the fiction, had answered the phone and given it to her, because his mother had never once in her life been able to resist Hana. "You didn't have to come," he said. "I know," she said. She came in anyway. Set the pot on the floor because there was no table. Produced 2 spoons from her coat pocket with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a woman who had thought ahead, who had planned for the specific reality of this apartment rather than the version she might have wished to find. She sat cross-legged on the floor and served him first. He stood in the doorway of his own borrowed poverty and watched her make herself at home in it, and felt something shift in his chest that he did not have adequate language for. He sat down. He ate. Outside, the city continued its indifferent roar. The bulbs swung. The radiator clicked. Neither of them said anything about the future. Neither of them needed to. Director Choi had the kind of face that photographed well. This was not an accident. He had spent considerable time and money ensuring that the version of himself the world encountered first, in magazine profiles, in boardroom introductions, in the particular angle he offered cameras at charity galas, was the version most likely to be trusted before he had earned it. He was generous with his smile, precise with his timing, and he had been watching Hana's company bleed quietly for 3 months with the patient, unhurried attention of a man who understood that the best moment to make an offer was not when someone was comfortable, but when they were tired. He chose a restaurant that was expensive without being aggressive about it. Neutral ground, ostensibly. The kind of place where difficult conversations were dressed in good lighting and presented alongside the wine list. Hana arrived 4 minutes early, which told him nothing. She always arrived early. It was a discipline, not an anxiety. She ordered water, did not open the menu. He recognized this too. She had not come to be wined. She had come to hear what he wanted and decide, quickly, what it was worth to her. He had underestimated women like this before. He did not intend to repeat the mistake, only to account for it. "Your receivables are 90 days out," he said, after the pleasantries had been dispensed with. "Your anchor client paused the contract, and the Myeongdong lease renewal is in 6 weeks. He said it gently. The way a doctor delivers a diagnosis he has been sitting with for longer than the patient has. Hana looked at him steadily. "You've been thorough." "I'm interested," he said. "That's what thoroughness looks like." He laid out the offer with the clean efficiency of a man who had rehearsed it enough to make it sound unrehearsed. Full acquisition of her firm, at a valuation generous enough to erase every debt and fund the next 3 years of Mrs. Park's treatment without Hana selling so much as a spare button. "And in exchange," she said, not a question. "In exchange," he said, "you stop wearing that ring." The restaurant continued around them. Silverware against porcelain, low conversation, the ambient sound of people who were not having this particular moment. Hana looked down at her hand. At the ring Kang-Dae had placed there in a different life, a different version of the world, before the collapse and the cramped apartment and the pot of soup on the floor. Then she looked back up. "You're not actually interested in me," she said quietly. "You're interested in what it would mean to have me. There's a difference." Choi smiled, the good smile, the photographed one. "Does the distinction matter if the outcome is the same?" "Yes," she said. She picked up her bag, left the water untouched. Behind her, Choi watched her go and reached, unhurried, for his phone. He had expected this. The first answer was never the final one. He simply needed to find the right pressure point. He was still looking. Kim's reports were always precise. This was a professional habit, built over 12 years of delivering information to a man who had no patience for approximation. Kang-Dae did not want impressions. He did not want interpretations. He wanted facts, sequenced correctly, without emotional editorializing, and Kim had trained himself to provide exactly that. Tonight, for the first time in 12 years, Kim found the format difficult. He stood in the doorway of the fourth-floor apartment. He never fully entered. Some boundary of propriety held even here, and read from his phone in the flat, careful voice he used for board summaries and threat assessments. Hana had taken on freelance work. 3 clients, all smaller than her usual standard, the kind of work she would have referred out 18 months ago. She was billing hours between 10 at night and 2 in the morning, after the studio's regular operations, which she was still maintaining at full capacity so her staff wouldn't know. She had canceled her car service, was taking the subway. She had missed lunch on 4 of the last 6 working days. Her assistant had started leaving food on her desk without comment, the way you leave water out for something that has forgotten to take care of itself. The heirlooms had begun quietly. A bracelet first, then a pair of earrings her mother had given her. Kim had traced the transactions through a consignment dealer in Insadong who had not realized, when he described his recent acquisitions to a stranger making casual conversation, that he was being professionally debriefed. The money was going to a specialist clinic in Mapo, a Dr. Shin, whose experimental immunotherapy protocol was not covered by standard insurance and cost, per month, more than most people earned in 4. All of it routed through a patient account, registered under a name Kim recognized. Mrs. Park. He stopped reading. The apartment was very quiet. Kang-Dae was sitting on the floor with his back against the wall. The same position Kim had found him in on the first night, the position of a man who had stripped away every comfort to feel something true and was now feeling considerably more than he had budgeted for. He hadn't moved since Kim started speaking. "She knows the treatment isn't covered," Kim said, because the silence required something in it. "She negotiated the payment plan herself, monthly. She's been telling the clinic she's a family friend." A family friend. Kang-Dae's jaw moved once, that was all. Kim looked at a point on the wall above his employer's head, because looking directly at him in this moment felt like a violation of something private. "Boss," he said quietly, "say the word, we end it tonight." The bulb swung slightly overhead. "No," Kang-Dae said. His voice was steady. Professionals stayed steady. He had built that reflex over 20 years, and it held now, just barely, like a wall taking on water. "Not yet," he said. Kim nodded, put his phone away. Neither of them said what they were both thinking, that the man who had designed this test was no longer sure he deserved to see the results. Mrs. Park had agreed to the ruse because her son had asked her to. This was, she had told him, the last time she would do something simply because he asked. He was 36 years old and still occasionally forgot that her compliance was a gift, not a given. But she had agreed, and she had maintained it through the initial visits, through the careful performances of worry and fragility, through the particular discipline of pretending not to know things she knew. She was, when required, an excellent actress. She had raised a son in difficult circumstances without letting him see the difficulty. That required a certain talent for performance. What she had not agreed to, what no one had consulted her on, was the part where it became real. Hana came on a Thursday, as she always did now. Thursdays and Sundays, without fail, regardless of what the week had taken from her. She arrived with fruit she had peeled and cut at home because Mrs. Park's hands ached in the cold, and with the particular quality of attention, unhurried, genuine, that could not be performed by someone who was simply managing an obligation. She sat beside the bed and asked about Mrs. Park's dreams, because Mrs. Park had mentioned once, in passing, that the medication gave her vivid ones, and Hana had remembered. This was the thing, she always remembered. Mrs. Park looked at this young woman, the shadows beneath her eyes deeper than last week, her wrists thinner in a way she was concealing beneath a long sleeve, and felt the agreed-upon words turn to ash in her mouth. She said them anyway, because her son needed to hear what Hana would do. "You should go," she said, not unkindly, but plainly. "Hana, you're young, your business needs you. My son," she paused, let the fiction hold her voice for a moment. "My son is not coming back from this, not the way he was. You deserve someone who can actually take care of you." Hana was quiet for a moment. Then she reached out and covered Mrs. Park's hand with both of hers. Carefully, the way you hold something that has survived a great deal and deserves to be treated accordingly. "Iyamianim," she said softly. "I'm not here because of what Kang-Dae has. I'm here because of what he is. And what he is, the part that matters he got from you." She paused. "So as long as you're here, I'm here. That's not a burden, that's just the truth." Mrs. Park looked at her for a long moment. Then she turned her face toward the window because she was not going to cry in front of this girl. She had her dignity. She cried anyway. In the corridor outside, Kang-Dae stood with his back against the wall and his eyes closed. Kim, beside him, said nothing. Did not move. Did not breathe loudly. Simply stood there while the most powerful man he had ever served came quietly, privately undone, and understood, finally, the precise and irreversible cost of the test he had designed. The documents arrived on a Tuesday. Not from Choi directly, he was too careful for that. They came through an intermediary, a lawyer with a practiced neutrality, and an office in Uedo that smelled like mahogany and managed distance. The kind of office that existed specifically to ensure that the people who sent documents never had to witness the faces of the people who received them. Hana read everything twice. This was her habit with contracts, once for the language, once for what the language was designed to conceal. She had learned this early in the first years of building her firm, when she had signed things too quickly and paid for the education in ways she preferred not to revisit. The debt was real, or real enough, constructed with the same precision Kim had brought to the original collapse. Threaded through enough legitimate channels that untangling it would require time and resources Hana no longer had. Men were owed money. Men who did not, the document implied with elegant indirection, involve themselves in formal dispute resolution. Signing the firm over to Choi's holding company would settle it. Completely, cleanly. She set the papers on her desk and looked at her studio. 4 years of it. The mood board still pinned to the walls, the fabric swatches arranged by season, the small framed photograph on the windowsill of the day they'd signed the original lease. Her and 2 staff members who were still with her, grinning in front of a door that had needed repainting, and a sign that had arrived misspelled and taken 3 weeks to replace. She thought about her staff, went through them one by one, the way she did sometimes when things were difficult, as a kind of private accounting of what actually mattered. Then she called Choi. He answered on the second ring, which meant he had been expecting her, which meant he already knew about the documents, which she had assumed but had needed confirmed. "I have conditions," she said. A brief pause, pleased but concealing it. "I'm listening." "My staff keep their positions for a minimum of 18 months. Contracted, not promised. Full benefits, no restructuring." She paused. "And the medical payments continue uninterrupted. Same clinic, same doctor, same protocol. That gets written into the agreement before I sign anything." "That's not a small ask," Choi said. "No," she agreed, "it isn't." Another pause. Longer this time. She could hear him recalibrating, had not expected her to negotiate from this position, had expected grief or anger or desperation, and received instead a woman who had already done her grieving privately and arrived at the table with a list. "All right," he said. "I'll need a week to review the revised terms." "Of course." She hung up, sat very still in her chair. Outside, her staff moved through the studio with the ordinary, oblivious energy of people who did not yet know that the ground beneath them had shifted. She did not go home that night. She stayed at her desk until the city outside the windows had gone dark and quiet, and drafted, by hand, personal letters to every single one of them. Just in case. The gala had been Choi's idea, naturally. He had a talent for theater, for understanding that power, to be fully effective, required an audience. The merger announcement would happen here, in the Grand Hyatt ballroom, beneath chandeliers that cost more than most people's apartments, in front of 200 guests who had been carefully selected for their ability to carry a story outward into the world that mattered. Hana stood near the window in a dress she had designed herself 3 years ago for an occasion she hadn't known yet. Midnight blue, understated in the way that required considerable effort to achieve. She had worn it tonight because it was the most herself she could manage to be, under the circumstances. Choi had greeted her at the entrance with the particular warmth of a man who believed he had already won. She had smiled in return with the particular warmth of a woman counting down. The room moved around her. Champagne, careful laughter, the ambient performance of people who understood that events like this were not celebrations, but negotiations conducted in formal wear. At 9:15, the lights dimmed slightly. Choi moved toward the podium. The doors opened. It was not a dramatic entrance. That was the thing she would remember afterward, how undramatic it was. No announcement. No commotion. Simply two men walking into a room with the unhurried certainty of people who had never, in their lives, needed to announce themselves. Kang-Dae was wearing charcoal. No tie. The same cold, still quality she had always known in him, except that tonight it wasn't contained. Tonight it simply occupied the room, the way weather occupies a landscape, without asking permission. Kim walked half a step behind and to the left. His expression was the expression of a man who had waited a very long time for this specific evening, and was finding it, professionally, quite satisfying. Choi saw him from the podium. The warmth left his face with the speed of a man who has just understood, completely and irreversibly, that he has been outmaneuvered. Kang-Dae didn't look at him immediately. He looked at Hana first, found her across the room with the directness of a man who had memorized exactly where she would be standing. And something moved briefly across his face that wasn't quite an apology and wasn't quite relief, and was, perhaps, both of those things pressed together into an expression that had no cleaner name. Then he turned to the room. What followed was not loud. Kang-Dae had never needed volume. Kim distributed documents with the quiet efficiency of a man for whom this moment had required considerable preparation and deserved to be executed correctly. Asset transfers, acquisition records, a paper trail that dismantled Choi's position with the thoroughness of someone who had been building the counter case from the very beginning. Every asset Hana had sold, purchased, held, and returned. Every debt, settled long before she had been asked to carry it. The room understood before Choi spoke. Rooms like this always did. 200 people recalibrated simultaneously, and the sound of it, that specific, collective shift, was the quietest, devastating thing Hana had ever heard. She looked at Kang-Dae. He was already looking at her. He didn't ask in the ballroom. That would have been Choi's way, the audience, the chandeliers, the performance of a grand gesture calibrated for maximum witness. Kang-Dae had spent enough time studying that particular playbook to know he wanted no part of it. He asked 3 days later, in her studio, after everyone else had gone home. He came without Kim, without the charcoal suit and the quiet authority and the atmospheric presence that filled rooms before he entered them. He came in the jacket she had last seen him wear in the 4th-floor apartment, deliberately, she understood. A choice about which version of himself was doing the asking. He sat across from her desk, which she noticed and said nothing about. He had always sat beside her before. The desk between them was honest. "I need to tell you something about my mother," he said first. She went still. "She's well," he said it quickly, because he had watched her carry the weight of that uncertainty for 6 months, and he was done now, contributing to it by even a single unnecessary second. "The treatments worked. Dr. Shin confirmed it 4 weeks ago. She's well, Hana. She's been well." The breath she released was not quite a sound. Something between relief and the particular exhaustion of a person who has been holding themselves very straight for a very long time and has just been given permission to stop. He watched her and did not look away, because he had looked away enough, had watched from corridors and rooftops and the dark interiors of cars while she quietly dismantled her life for people she loved, and the least he owed her now was to be present for what that truth cost her to receive. "I designed a test," he said, "for a woman who had already passed everyone that mattered, without my knowing, without my asking." He paused. "There is no adequate accounting for that. I'm not going to pretend there is." Hana looked at him for a long moment. "She gave me the doenjang recipe," she said finally. "Your mother, when I called her." A pause. "I think she was rooting for you the entire time." Something crossed his face that was almost, briefly, a smile. "She told me the same thing about you." They were married in the spring. Not in a ballroom. In the garden of the house where Mrs. Park had raised her son, small, unhurried, attended by people who had earned their presence there through something other than their usefulness. Mrs. Park sat in the front row in a yellow dress she had chosen herself and cried without any attempt at dignity, and nobody minded. Kim stood to one side with the expression of a man who was not crying and was committed to that position despite considerable pressure. There were no grand speeches, no pronouncements about empire or legacy or the transfer of power. Kang-Dae took Hana's hands and said, quietly enough that only she could hear, that he had spent his life calculating the cost of everything and had only recently learned that some things arrived without a price, and that he intended to spend whatever time he had left being worthy of that. Hana looked at him the way she always looked at him. Directly, without performance. "Then let's not waste it," she said. The garden was very still. Spring light came through the trees in the unhurried way of things that have no reason to rush. It was enough. It was, in fact, everything.